NATO's unofficial purpose, in the words of Lord Hastings Ismay, was to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and Germany down. So today we're going to explore what this actually means for Europe. Coming at you from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. I've been feeling a little bit under the weather over the past week, so I didn't get around to uploading this until today. But I appreciate your patience. Hopefully, I'll have something else additionally by the end of the weekend. This one on Russia. But this one is about Battleground Europe. America seeks, above all else, to retain global hegemony. Now, the global nature of this hegemony is probably an illusion and has been since it first seemed to appear in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I say this, then the EU was more powerful in that day and China was on the rise. And it's not so much that the U.S. lacked worldwide influence, that that's certain. It was more like our influence far away from home was limited by practical considerations. We had a limited ability to project power. We had a greater ability than most anybody else to project power, especially a long way away from home, but nonetheless it was limited. So we ran into only minimal difficulty in the Balkans in the 1990s, but we had our hands full with Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s. And crucially, those were the types of wars that the U.S. was preparing for in the future. There's a saying that the generals are always preparing for the next war to be just like the last one. And it was during this period, the 2000s and 2010s, that Russia and China made their most notable and decisive gains. Um, Russia, during this period, decided that um, it had to build up its military um, because it was losing trust in the West. And China, at the time, was experiencing um, double digit or close to double digit growth each year, which grew its economy exponentially. Um, and that's how it became a peer competitor economically with the United States. So we were recently shamefully chased out of Afghanistan by the very people we fought to occupy it. Iraq has long since become a Shiite detachment of Iran, where we continue to have a shrinking unwanted military presence. Attempts to muster radical jihadist groups to ouster Bashar al Assad in Syria failed, and we retain a small, unwanted military presence there as well. China, Russia, and India have risen up and rejected Western leadership. Africa seems to be in the process of evicting the remnant residue of their colonial masters and partnering with the Chinese and Russians toward economic development. So, aside from Taiwan and Israel, Europe is the main expression of the American empire and a major focus of the East West conflict. So, many people have asked themselves, why is the U.S. forcing Europe to reduce or abandon Russian energy, given the economic consequences to the continent? The U.S. can't afford for Europe to evade or escape its control. Without Europe, America is a regional power with nukes. The Western American Empire is the transatlantic alliance. But there are issues with this. Europe has sent much of its military capacity to the Ukraine. As a practical matter, it is dependent on the U.S. for its defense. The European armies are numbered in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes in the tens of thousands, and usually in the tens of thousands of those that they could actually put on the field. Um, the problem is that the U.S. has also sent large amounts of weapons to the Ukraine, depleting its own stocks. Apart from the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal, its capacity to defend Europe is largely psychological and illusory. As a practical matter, due to mutually assured destruction, there is actually no obstacle that presents itself to Moscow preventing it, if it chose to spend the conventional forces and casualties to do so, from marching to the French border. Why do I say the French border? France is a nuclear power in its own right, as is Britain. They are the only two in Europe besides Russia. Now, it is true that U.S. NATO nuclear weaponry is stationed in other NATO countries, but having them on the soil of these countries is not the point. The point is whether the countries who own them, that is, the U.S., would be willing to risk nuclear retaliation on the owner's nation, that is, the U.S., in order to defend non nuclear countries. Article 5 of NATO says the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self defense, recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Article 5 of NATO notwithstanding, I believe we can safely say that the answer to the question, would the U.S. be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Central and Eastern Europe, is probably no. Had there been such a willingness, it would have been expressed in the Ukraine. So it's only a nuclear country defending itself from invasion which would be expected to use its own nukes in self-defense. That's why I went into some detail before on the mutually assured destruction concept. It's not that these countries adopt this as military doctrine. It's that all of them consider the implications of everything they do with nuclear weapons. And so the theory behind mutually assured destruction just is what it is. They have to consider it because they have to consider the self-destructive nature, potential self-destructive nature of any set of choices that they might make. So what I'm getting at is that it's probably only a nuclear country defending itself, which would be expected to use its own nukes in self-defense. The first one of those that Russia would encounter in the drive across Europe is France. No other country in between it and France has its own nukes. Knowing this is what makes the EU and the US extraordinarily nervous. Or I should say, the fact that Russia knows that this is the case is what is making them a tad flustered. There is no effective deterrence between the Russian western border and the French eastern border, only the goodwill of the Russians, and Putin, a moderate, will not live forever. As we've remarked before, it is not what a country says it will do, it is what it is capable of doing. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that the Russians intend to march across Europe. I'm not even convinced they intend to march all the way across Ukraine. However, that doesn't mean that they couldn't if they wanted to, and that the U.S. and Europe would be loath to use nuclear weapons to stop them. And none of that changes the fact that, as far as conventional forces are concerned, neither Europe nor the United States has the capacity to stop the Russians from marching across Europe. I'm talking about potentials and something that theoretically could happen. But the fact that it could happen is the problem. The West has a problem, or more specifically, Europe has a problem. And there's a tension in the air in Europe, and the substance of this tension is this: America will likely not defend us in the event of a Russian invasion, so we should be making deals with Russia, but we are militarily occupied by the U.S. That is what NATO essentially is. And so, in order to keep Europe down and unable to either arm or defect into the arms of Russia, America is waging an indirect economic war against Germany and the rest of the EU through imposing sanctions on Russia and interfering with the transit of oil and gas from Russia to the EU. This, in turn, is devastating to the Europe's economy. Sanctions are deindustrializing Germany. Germany is the manufacturing center of Europe, and inflation is rising across the EU. This is driven by higher energy prices due to the sanctions, which in turn make transportation of commodities more expensive. At the same time, other commodities are being prevented from transit from Russia to the EU, which is only exacerbating this dynamic. Interest rates have risen to fight the inflation, which has further retarded the economy. Remember the mission statement: keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans, or Europeans in general, down. That's going well for Washington. And it's going well for Russia since Russia's pivot to the east has proved to be quite lucrative for it and for China. However, the Europeans are having a bad day, and it is worth taking a closer look at exactly how bad a day they're having and what the political effects of this are likely to be. Germany was in recession in fourth quarter of 2022 and the first quarter of 2023, and has dipped back into recession in the second half of 2023, with expected average growth for the year at from negative 0.3 to negative 0.5%. Other European economies like the Netherlands and Italy have posted anemic growth below 1% in 2023. Compared with recent years, all one can say is that present performance is better than it was during the height of COVID. However, it seems trending downward, with growth in Germany being revised down 0.6 from its predicted level of positive 2% in May of 23 to negative 0.4 for the year. So Germany was the manufacturing powerhouse of Europe, but seems to be currently undergoing deindustrialization due to the U.S., EU, Russia sanctions. The price of gas in Germany is roughly double what it was in 2021 and before the sanctions. Germany got about 40% of its imported oil from Russia. Since January of 2023, Germany has imported neither oil nor gas from Russia, oil ending at the end of last year and gas in August of 22. Deindustrialization is not something that happens overnight. It's a gradual process whereby European industry becomes less competitive on the global market as higher energy costs are passed through in the form of higher prices. What we saw something similar happen in Britain in the 1990s as many factories shut down and few reopened. But the potential deindustrialization of Europe will probably be more rapid than the British example. A significant amount of German industry is moving production to Hungary and other countries, not sanctioning Russian industry, and also to the United States, which is, but as is practically or pretty much energy self-sufficient. As for energy prices returning to normal in Europe, this seems unlikely. Last week, the head of Britain's energy regulator admitted that energy bills were unlikely to fall to pre-crisis levels for at least 2 years. Those who know suggest that the regulator is probably being optimistic. Qatar's energy minister warned that the worst is yet to come for European oil and gas shortages. He would be in a position to know since Europe is relying heavily on Qatari LNG imports for their energy supplies, as well as those from the United States. Increased energy prices are estimated to have killed an additional 68,000 persons who otherwise would have survived last winter. It's through The Economist. Um, in some, Germany and Europe are sliding into recession, possibly depression. Now, the political effects of the sanctions and economic downturn. Um, these realities are felt in varying degrees throughout Europe, the UK being another country severely hit by inflation from the Russia sanctions rounds. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany is near the 20% mark in public support, which would make it much more difficult to avoid as a coalition partner for future governments. Other governments have actually fallen over the conflict. Slovakia, for example, elected a right wing government in its recent election, and the Netherlands gave Geert Wilders' party 23% of the vote, though it will likely be unable to form a coalition. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, despite winning a plurality, did not win enough to form a coalition either. But the point is that these parties are on the rise, and um, the institutional resistance they're encountering can only last so long. Um, Such instability will likely result in more rounds of elections sooner rather than later, and the trend is clear. Hungary has already elected Viktor Orban. Italy elected Giorgia Meloni. France has returned a more conservative parliament in its recent elections, though it is stuck with Macron until 2027. Sweden Democrats and the coalition they lead prevailed last year in Swedish elections. The hard right Finns party in Finland has recently become the second largest party in the country and part of the ruling coalition. I refer to some of these parties as hard right parties, and that's not an insult. That's high praise from me. I consider myself on the hard right. Um, European hard right parties met in Italy on Sunday, December the 3rd, vowing to reshape the European Union after next year's European Parliament elections, toughening the bloc's approach on immigration and softening its climate policies to protect jobs and industry. These hard right parties are also much more likely to do business with Russia. The the hard right parties also tend to be more religiously conservative, and thus they don't have the liberal West knee jerk reaction to Russia as a conservative Orthodox threat. New York Times columnist Hans Kundnani um, remarked that there's a coming together of the center right and the far right, especially on questions around identity, immigration, and Islam. That's within Europe. With European parliamentary elections next year, this convergence is bringing into clearer view the possibility of something like a far right European Union. Until recently, such a thing would have seemed unthinkable. Now it's distinctly plausible. Even figures like President Emmanuel Macron of France have begun to frame international politics as a clash of civilizations, in which a strong, united Europe must defend itself. Now, my calculations show that 15 of the EU's 27 member countries now have hard right parties, which have support of 20% or more in opinion polls, including every large country except for Spain. European elections are scheduled for 2024 across the year, um, and European parliamentary elections are scheduled as well. Um, However, the EU Commission is the body that holds the power to initiate legislation. It has a representative of each EU nation on the Commission. Thus, there's a certain conservative bent to the malleability of the EU legislative system. The ECR and the ID parties will likely pick up a significant number of seats, with the more centrist coalition retaining control unless there is an upset, um, which more and more people are thinking is likely. Yet, depending on the composition of the council, that is, depending on the leadership of the respective EU states in 6 months, it is possible that the EU right will become significantly more powerful. All this at a time when the economy is tanking and faith in the leadership of the United States is fading. As this program goes to production, Olaf Scholz's coalition in Germany appears to be heading for dissolution. The Free Democrats have called a referendum in support of its leaving the coalition over Scholz's decision to bypass limits on deficit spending due to the current economic crisis. It's possible, even likely, that the Free Democrats will depart and Scholz will be forced into another grand coalition with the CDU in order for his government to survive. This would unite all the other extant major parties besides the hard right AfD into a coalition. The left is reorganizing itself at this point. This would include the Greens, the CSU, and others, with the only opposition remaining to Scholz's seemingly cursed SPD-led government being the AfD. This is a recipe for regime change in Germany because, in that circumstance, votes would migrate from the CDU to AfD. CDU is the largest party. AfD is now the second largest party. Scholz's party, the SPD, has sunk to abysmally low popularity levels of around 14%. Recent polling suggests that CDU remains the most popular party, but the AfD has taken second place with above 20%. Whether fear or realism become the motivations, over time there will arise a mounting impulse toward rapprochement with Russia. Europe simply cannot afford to lose Russian energy, as has been demonstrated by its continued import of reduced amounts of the same despite sanctions. And China is a variable that militates in favor of a détente of sorts, regardless of the wishes of the U.S. But Europe is in a terrible and unenviable position. Pulled to the east by economic considerations, energy the foremost, and pulled to the west by the U.S. occupation force, NATO, and America's dominance of the EU governmental apparatus. The rise of the European right is not actually the decisive dynamic, at least not directly. The determinative variable is the status of the European Green parties. As their power fades, the likelihood of détente with Russia increases. They're against import of Russian energy across the board, even willing to go back to coal-fired plants in order to make up the difference. And their power is fading. What spectators must realize is that Europe's economic needs are not going to change, and thus its government will have to. This may take some time, but it is already in the process. Added to all this Sturm und Drang is the specter on the horizon of the EU taking over the support of Ukraine as the U.S. withdraws. Ukraine will end up being a bleeding sore on the butt of Europe. Europe seems to be floating accession talks again for the EU and NATO in an effort to keep the U.S. involved in the conflict in the Ukraine as America seeks to distance itself from the victims, so to speak. And that is a wrap-up of what has been going on in Europe. There is also yet another wrinkle in the whole thing, which is just seems like piling on at this point. Not only will Europe have to, or probably end up taking over responsibility for some rehabilitation of Western Ukraine. I think Russia will retain control over Eastern and Central Ukraine. But also, there is more energy shock in the pipeline because the group called Ansarullah in Yemen, who are often referred to as the Houthis, which their leader, one of his names is al-Houthi. um, had been interfering with shipping going into the Red Sea. And this accounts for a considerable amount of oil coming into Europe. And they basically shut down, to a large extent, uh, shipment through the Red Sea, and now everything is having to go through around the Cape of Africa, which adds a lot of time and expense to prices, which will affect inflation and the price of energy in Europe. This has gotten to the point where the U.S. is considering, well, has actually sent forces to intimidate the Yemenis, they hope, and possibly use force to coerce them to stop doing this. But that is all in the process and is all lingering out there, or hovering out there. And so it doesn't seem to be affecting energy prices that much. I think I was looking at it yesterday, and the price of oil had gone up $5 a barrel. Um, but there's potential, if it goes on long enough, for that to just be another nail in the coffin of Europe for the time being until it comes to its senses. So, if you find this program valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.